Yes, folks, hello, welcome once again to Mod Extra Games and Collectibles. I'm Chris, this is my channel. Absolute pleasure to have you with me here today. And while we are getting through the January lull of nothing to review, I am once again falling back on my reserve list of video themes. And in today's installment, I want to talk specifically about Marvel UK's Action Force comic. This comic, I know regulars around these parts will have heard me mention it before. It's the driving force of my love of G.I. Joe. It's where it all began for me, and here we are, 25, 30 years later, still banging on about G.I. Joe. I think Battle Action Force and the Red Shadow stuff and Baron Ironblood and the SAS and Z-Force and blah, blah, blah is actually really well spoken to around and about in the community, and there's lots of great videos sort of doing that history of the origins there. But this little window of time where Marvel UK were printing Action Force comics had a significant impact on me, and so I want to talk about that today. Word of warning to the wise, though, just to manage expectations, this isn't going to be a well-researched, breakdown of the history. I want to talk about where it sits in the narrative of a comic book fan, a child of the 80s growing up into the 90s, and the impact that it had on me as a kind of case study, which I think will be a very similar story to lots of other UK-based comic book readers. And talk about why it had such an impact and why it still resonates with me today and has been a part of me being a G.I. Joe fan in the here and now. And just to keep it fun, I'm going to show you some little quirky bits and bobs about the Marvel UK Action Force comic as well, which you might find interesting. So without further delay, let's get into it.
Action Force International Heroes.
Just to contextualize it though, in case you are unfamiliar with the kind of wider story, here in the UK we had a weekly comic book by the name of Battle Action, which was a boys comic started in the 70s. That was a war story comic book. Arguably, it definitely had a more kind of grounded, gritty tone to it. It told, kind of World War II stories and stuff for boys in black and white. And then a little later, Palitoy secured the license to use the G.I. Joe stuff, brought it over here, rebranded under Action Force. It kind of got rid of the Cobra versus G.I. Joe kind of narrative that surrounded it. They had SAS-style operatives. The villains were, Baron Ironblood was like this Swiss madman and things. It was a little bit more closer to kind of that classic British war comic style in the first instance than it was the more kind of US style kind of war story stuff that was going on with G.I. Joe. And then Battle Action kind of at that same time transitioned into Battle Action Force, and then much later transitioned completely into Action Force. And this is where Marvel UK kind of took over the license and kind of inherited a thing to deal with. And this was a real big part of a kind of UK child's comic book reading evolution. I, as a comic book reader, like many, this narrative will resonate, I think, with UK viewers of this video for sure. You start out on Topper and Beano and Dandy, with the Bash Street Kids and Dennis the Menace and Desperate Dan and all that kind of stuff. And then as you get a little bit older, you then start to graduate into your Battle Actions, your Eagles with, your Dan Dares and your Detective Zeds and stuff. Might even start straying into, if you're a sports fan, Roy the Rovers, those types of things. And then as you got a little bit older, that's when you started engaging a bit more deeply with things like the Marvel UK titles or the DC Comics reprints of stuff like Batman Monthly, which was a title that shot up in popularity when the Tim Burton film came out in 1989. Also, if you're a little bit more mature or you were slightly older at this point, you might also be deeply into sort of 2000 AD and Judge Dredd and that type of thing, which I think was kind of targeted at slightly older audiences. Or you might be reading, if you're even a little bit older yet, you might be reading something called Deadline, which was like this kind of anthology magazine that had comic book strips and kind of indie music interviews and stuff about films. Deadline was where you would find out about the latest Hong Kong movie import or where anime started to creep into the story, these types of things. And so you had this kind of evolution of a comic book reader. And I think that moment, that very kind of core moment from about 1987 till about 1994, kind of where you ended up settling in that sort of landscape of British comics influenced where you were going to set your stall out for the rest of your life, basically. And I was, for sure, a Marvel UK reader. Action Force, quite specifically, Transformers, Captain Britain, Dragon's Claw. What else did I read? All sorts of stuff. They were publishing these great titles. And that's the kind of context of where Marvel UK's Action Force sits. And as I've said many times before, collectors of G.I. Joe action figures here in the UK were actually collectors of Action Force figures. You were either picking up the early Palatoy licensed stuff, the 5 POA figures, and then sort of graduated into the O-ring G.I. Joes that were then being licensed under the Action Force title. And you were getting your stories, you were getting your kind of cross-media tie-in from the Marvel UK Action Force comic books. I never saw a G.I. Joe cartoon for years and years and years. My first experience of animated G.I. Joe was G.I. Joe the movie, which was retitled Action Force the movie in my world.
It's Action Force against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. They will never give up. They're always there, fighting for freedom over land and international heroes.
Now, a lot of the stuff I'm about to go on to talk about now, I didn't know at the time. I was a 10-year-old reading comic books, getting excited. Obviously, the comic book reading DNA was firmly installed in me, and I carried on reading comic books all the way through the 90s into the noughties and still read comic books today. This is information that I've come to know and understand, revisiting this stuff and coming back to it years later. But the Action Force rebrand of G.I. Joe kept going until 1990, I think, off the top of my head. And so it's always been, international heroes, Action Force, the international mission group. It's never been anything else, and it was all driven by these comic books. Now, what makes them particularly unique is a couple of things, and I'm going to start by talking about the stories within. I mean, it's a comic book. You've got to talk about the comic strips. So the way an average Marvel UK Action Force comic was put together, you'd have 3 storylines, independent parts. It was kind of an anthology of 3 stories that would then be broken down and continued over several arcs through several issues. You then have some additional information in there. They had intelligence profiles and TAC reports. There'd be a little comic strip which was in the style of the kind of Beano and Dandy type stuff, which was Combat Colin. The strips included were not always necessarily G.I. Joe directly. There was reprints of some Spider-Man stories in there. There were some reprints of Shang-Chi in there, so it wasn't always necessarily precisely G.I. Joe Action Force, your 3 stories running through, with bits peppered in between, were not always directly G.I. Joe related. However, on that front, on the G.I. Joe front, what was particularly interesting was that while they'd licensed the Marvel US comic books written by Larry Hama, they were producing these comic books weekly. And as a result of that, there just wasn't enough material to, they kept catching up or running out of US material to reprint. So what they did is they took the US storylines, rejigged them around, started inserting, independently written material from UK writers and drawn by UK artists to fill out the storyline. They restructured it. They took story arcs out and put them in different spots and then fleshed it out with their own additional bits in between to kind of make it all work continuity-wise and restructured the whole thing so they had enough material to be producing weekly. So they almost entirely changed some characterizations. Certainly on a superficial level, dialogue was rewritten and references to G.I. Joe were taken out and American spelling was changed to, UK English spelling of stuff. In fact, let me show you some examples. So I went did a little bit of a digging around. You can see here that here's Wild Weasel and Firefly in the jungle, and they've changed the reference from Action Force to from the Joes to Action Force. I also found another example with the Baroness referencing Action Force instead of G.I. Joe, simple stuff like that. Words like honor, was changed from Honor to Honour for the UK spelling. But sometimes, because of the restructuring and the inserting of, independently written material, whole bits of dialogue were changed. Like, let me show you this. So in this scene here, Flint and Lady J are already well-established characters for a UK Action Force reader. In fact, Flint and Lady J are significant. They're like the 2 leading forces of many of the independently written material. Flint leads the Action Force, the UK Action Force team. And so he doesn't meet Lady J for the very first time in this scene. He's known Lady J for ages, so they had to entirely rewrite the dialogue. And you can see here he's saying, "How you doing, Jay? You okay? No bruises or bumps?" Rather than saying, "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Lady J." You know, they had to entirely restructure the script, you know, re-dialogue it in order to make it fit into the independently written material that they were using in Action Force UK. Here's another couple of examples along the same vein. So the whole Major Blood and Baroness betraying Cobra Commander by trying to get Billy to assassinate him, and the whole Billy stuff with Billy and Storm Shadow was written out the story and reintroduced much later on in Action Force UK. And so they had to re-letter and re-dialogue any references to what's going on there. So here you can see in the Action Force title, all references to Major Blood betraying Cobra Commander and the Billy situation is removed from the storyline. Here's another example I dug out from around the same time, where again, in Action Force, the whole Major Blood betrayal and the Billy storyline is removed entirely. All the scenes with Storm Shadow and Billy are just cut out and turned into one single arc later on in Action Force UK. So really having to, you know, like completely jig stuff around. Another great example is the famous silent interlude issue, because here in the UK, we had a prologue and an epilogue to try and insert the silent interlude story into our own continuity in the narrative that we were reading. So there was a whole storyline set up to establish why Snake Eyes was going, and then a whole storyline set up afterwards to explain the aftermath with Destro and Storm Shadow. It wasn't existing in the same narrative set of events that US readers were getting from Larry Hama in A Real American Hero. There were other weird things going on as well, like complete character name changes. I didn't know Footloose was Footloose for a long time, because for me, in Action Force UK, Footloose was called Longslide. Whole character origins were changed as well, in terms of like where they were from and how, you know, their journey through the armed forces to end up in Action Force. I've shared some of these on my Instagram before, but I'll show you them here now. Like Flint was from Lincoln, Lady J was from County Cork in Ireland, while Bill was from Hull. The whole cowboy connection just completely ignored. Rock and Roll was Cornish, he was from Cornwall. Outback was Scottish, and he learned his kind of survivalist ways in the Highlands of Scotland. Lieutenant Falcon was from Glastonbury in Somerset. Airtight was German. Beachhead was from New Zealand. Hit and Run was from Essex. Hot Seat was from Bath. You know, loads of just whole origins completely restructured. And I mentioned before about like the Shang-Chi storylines being published in there, and it was kind of implied, in fact leaned into very heavily, that the Shang-Chi storylines that we were seeing were existing in the same universe and in the same context as the Action Force storylines. There's even a reference that Quick Kick was trained by Shang-Chi. So it was a whole different experience. It was a completely different experience. And let's not forget, you know, at the same time, Marvel UK were publishing a Transformers title where they were doing the same thing, taking licensed US material and supplementing it with their own independently written UK-based writers and artists material, and that had its whole own continuity. And then eventually, later on, they brought the two together and they did a Transformers and G.I. Joe crossover, just like they did in the US, but it was its own thing. They went all in to the point where when Action Force UK, the title stopped, it became Transformers and Action Force. That's where they continued the Action Force stories. Although this is also where Visionary comic book stuff was brought to us in the UK, was through Transformers and Visionaries. In fact, I might have one. Digging through my pile there you go. Transformers and Visionaries. So it was all rejigged around. The narratives, the storylines, the kind of beats of everything was very, very different for my experience as it was for, perhaps you, US watcher right now. And the covers, man. I mean, Jesus, the covers were just something else. Take a look at these. I'll just throw a couple on camera right now. They are just absolutely outstanding. How, as a child in the 80s, a comic book fan, no less, who'd been reading Battle Action and Eagle and starting to dip their toe into the sort of deeper waters of Marvel UK Comics in 2000 AD, how could you not pick up, a cover that looks like this? You know what I mean? Really outstanding stuff, and a big part of the appeal, when you talk about that sort of newsagent shelf appeal for a kid trying to spend their pocket money. And to step outside of the stories themselves that were in the Action Force UK comic books for a moment, this was a breeding ground, or one of many breeding grounds here in the UK, that kind of informed the UK comic book invasion of the US mainstream, as we went into the 90s. Action Force itself had some very notable contributors who back then were just sort of jobbing UK writers and artists, but who later became superstar writers and artists. Grant Morrison, Grant Morrison and Steve Yoel did a story in Action Force Monthly, which was like a martial artsy, Snake Eyes-y, Storm Shadowy story. Grant Morrison, I'd be surprised if any comic book fan watching this didn't know who Grant Morrison was, but certainly those two carried on to collaborate all the way through things like The Invisible, Animal Man, The Invisibles, The Filth. Those two worked together for years. Dan Abnett, who obviously went on to do an awful lot of stuff for DC and Marvel in later years. You had artists like Dougie Braithwaite, John McCrae, Brian Hitch, all producing work. And then in the wider Marvel UK context, you had folks like Alan Grant, Dave Gibbons, Alan Moore, of course, with his Captain Britain stuff. John McCrae, have I already mentioned John McCrae? But, people who went on to become very significant writers and artists, big titles down the line. I've always been a big John McCrae fan because I love Hitman and Demon Etrigan. And this space, alongside things like 2000 AD, really drove that UK invasion that went to take over things like DC's Vertigo line and then subsequently into the mainstream. So it's not just notable for having its own continuity, and it's not just notable for kind of doing its own thing. It's also particularly notable because of what was going on in the UK comic book industry at the time. And of course, we have to pause and call out Simon Furman, who was, a massive driving force as a writer to the independently created material that has really gone down to become legend certainly in the world of Transformers, but also for folks like me who read Action Force UK. Action Force UK only lasted a small window of time. It was like 87 to about 89. In fact, as I mentioned before, in the 90s, then Action Force started to transition back into the G.I. Joe brand, the G.I. Joe title. The cartoons started to become a little bit more prevalent here in the UK. But at that point, I'd moved on. Talking about that kind of evolution as a comic book reader and a comic book fan. I started to take an interest in the X-Men. I lived through the Jim Lee boom of the X-Men era, started reading Liefeld stuff, started reading McFarlane stuff. I was of that right age. And I think a lot of folks watching this in the UK will be the same, that you went through the UK stuff of the 80s edging into the 90s and then sort of transitioned over to US print comics. That said, 2000 AD, Jesus weathered all storms and has carried on to this day. So, there's still some hardcore fans out there who kept it UK. But, I started reading Deadline, getting interested in kind of more mature titles, more mature stuff, started reading monthly anthologies that included some of the more mature US print stuff. It was getting reprinted, and then just found a comic book shop. And then moved entirely over into the US printing stuff. But I never let it go. I always maintained an interest in Captain Britain, driven by these Marvel UK titles. I always maintained an interest in characters like Death's Head, who started out over here. And of course, as you guys well know, if you're a regular around these parts, I always maintained an interest in Action Force stroke G.I. Joe. It was deeply influential on me. And, I've said before that then I kind of moved on to other stuff. Like I say, in the 90s, I was more about Batman and Superman and the X-Men, 90s comic book superhero stuff. But then IDW did its own continuity of G.I. Joe, and I read that and just rediscovered my love of it. And the reason I picked it up is because I loved Action Force so much, and then went on to, investigate and discover the actual core source material and check out the cartoons, because they were finally sort of more accessible to me as an adult fan. And now here we are many years later, and I'm doing a little collectibles channel on YouTube, and lines like G.I. Joe Classified are a massive part of what I'm collecting, and it's all down to Action Force UK. You can't understand how deeply influential it was on me, and I think you'll probably find if you ask any other UK-based fans around and about in this community, they'll tell you the same. All right, there you go, folks. Well, there is, I don't know what you'd call that, a little kind of vloggy story about the influence of the Marvel UK Action Force comic book on a on an individual such as myself who has obviously kept going in the nerd life and has come back home to G.I. Joe based on his love of Action Force back then. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, it wasn't a well-researched kind of history of Action Force. I wanted to kind of talk about its influence a little bit more as someone who was influenced by it. But let me know in the comments down below if you enjoyed that. Let me know if you want me to talk more about some of that kind of more UK experience stuff from a nerd like myself, man-child nerd, who lived through it all and kind of how it all connects to the bigger story of our nerd loves today. But that's all I've had to say. Thanks very much for watching. Have yourselves a great day. Have yourselves a great week. And I'll catch you around these parts again for another video sometime soon. All right? Take it easy, folks.